Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. This is episode 93. This week, you will hear from a retired veteran who served for 20 years in the U.S. Army, much of which he served in the capacity of a sexual assault response coordinator. My guest is Orvie B. Baker, Jr. Orvie is not only a retired SARC vet, he is also currently a filmmaker. And his newest project is a story about a very unique and important location in Minneapolis. I don't want to steal his thunder, so I'm going to let him tell you about his project, plus all about his passion and work towards helping bring justice to victims and survivors of sexual assault and rape. Here's Orvie. Orvie B. Baker, Jr., thank you for joining me on the Sexual Assault Survivor Stories podcast. It is an honor and a pleasure to have you with me today.
Thank you for having me, Dave.
Just so my audience knows, I was skimming through Facebook and Instagram and saw a post that Orvie had done, I think it was on Facebook, talking about a project that he's working on. I'm going to let him tell you about it, but I reached out because of that project and asked Orvie if he'd be willing to talk to us on this show. He graciously agreed, and so here he is. Orvie, tell us about yourself and what it is that you posted about and why I was so interested.
Okay, just a short little story about myself. My name is Orvie B. Baker, Jr. I'm a 20-year retired Army veteran, victim advocate, sexual assault response coordinator, and a storyteller. I'm working on a documentary called The Survivors Memorial Documentary on a memorial, the first and only of its kind in the United States, dedicated to survivors of sexual violence.
Orvie, where is that located? And tell me how you found out about the memorial itself and why you're so interested in it.
The memorial is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, specifically Boom Island Park. I first found out about it on a newsreel that talked about the vandalization, the memorial being tarnished. And it shocked me for two reasons. Number one, who would vandalize something like this? And then number two, why is it just now that I'm finding out about it? So I went out to the memorial and I was awestruck of the size of it, because in my 20 years of military service, the only time I've seen anything for a memorial usually was a static display during the month of April. And for the longest, it would probably be a week at the longest that was put up. But this is a permanent structure in the park. And unfortunately, it's been vandalized twice. While I was going to school for digital cinematography, one of my projects was to do a mini documentary. And I decided to do it on that. And I got to meet with the people that actually was responsible for creating it, as well as the artist that repaired it, Miss Lori Green. After I graduated, I decided, you know what? I think this thing is important enough for the world to know about. That's why I started on this quest to do the documentary, not so much as to showcase my background in the military as a SARC, SAPR program manager and trainer, but to let the world know that somebody has taken a step forward to actually put a light on survivors of sexual violence. And I think that's super important because, as I said, my job was in victim advocacy in the military. And one of the things I noticed parallel with this memorial was that as soon as the limelight is shone on the subject, it's almost like a spark. It comes up, it's bright, people are pointing and talking, and then it's forgotten about. And I don't want this memorial to be forgotten about, just like I don't want survivors of sexual violence to be ever forgotten about.
I love that because it holds hands with the whole purpose of what this podcast is all about. I commend you for your desire for that end, that it not be forgotten, that it's known about worldwide. I so appreciate what you're doing. What are some of the specifics about the memorial that drew you to it? And do you know how long it's been there?
What drew me to the memorial, again, is this ongoing passion to be an advocate for survivors. And I immediately connected with that memorial, almost like a real life survivor. It had been through a traumatic experience, and I wanted to know what part can I do to help that memorial move forward, like we would with survivors or victims. You would come forward, you would tell what you can do, but you want to see how they can move forward with it. And I just have to say, I am super honored that when I brought this project to Minneapolis Parks and Recreations, they immediately got behind me on the project. I was surprised. When I was a student, I didn't have to pay permits to film because I was a student in the area. But once you're not a student, everywhere you try to film, somebody wants some money for something, and it's understandable. The park was the same way. But after I told them what the documentary was going to be for and why, they waived all of my permit fees. And when I say all of them, every bit of filming that I do at the park, they don't charge me for it.
That's awesome. I think all of us that are listening in need to give some appreciation to the Minneapolis Parks and Rec Department, right?
Yeah, I would greatly appreciate that. A wonderful team out there. When I first wanted to pitch this idea to them after school, I really thought that they were just going to send me a letter saying, hey, we appreciate your interest and you still have to pay. And that was about it. But they've had meetings with me. I actually have another follow-up meeting with them. And every time I bring the idea to them, it's met with a lot of enthusiasm. They get it. I have to stress that because in this field, and I'm pretty sure you know the same feeling I have, sometimes we're like an island to ourselves. The victims and survivors are kind of worried till they get to know us. The leadership that we're working for feel like we're working against them. So constantly having to prove ourselves until they let us in the fold as part. When somebody just immediately grabs on and says, we understand your mission, let's move forward, it's greatly appreciated. I mean, I've been doing this since 2005 when I first became a victim advocate in Iraq. Since day one, it has been a battle, and it continues to be a battle.
For sure. What you're doing, I think, means so much, not only to the community that listens to this podcast, but obviously to Minneapolis and the citizenry there. It's also way awesome that the city has really supported you and joined forces with you on this.
This memorial was started by a lady named Sarah Super. She was sexually assaulted by a boyfriend. And when they told the story, they pretty much left out her version of the story and talked about her like she was just a number or element. And she was not okay with that. So she decided to contact the media and let them know who she was and tell her story. From that, she decided that she wanted something to be said about this in some kind of statement, and she wanted to do a memorial bench. Well, that memorial bench was an idea hatched in 2015, and ideas started snowballing moving forward from a bench to a full-size memorial in the park. The memorial was dedicated and opened on the 10th of October, 2020. Unfortunately, COVID was happening, so a lot of people had to Zoom in. Miss V, the playwright for Vagina Chronicles, I believe that's the name of her show, and Miss Tamara Burke, the creator of the Me Too movement, came in and gave some statements about the memorial. So I thought that was very impactful. But because of COVID, a lot of people don't know that. Now we can jump into me and my reason for doing the documentary. Immediately, like I said before, I saw a parallel between survivors and that memorial. And in my documentary, I looked to tell the history of the memorial, how it started, how the memorial and survivors, both military and civilian, are going through the same course. And I want to end it with what I would like to see done with that memorial. Because like I said before, this memorial is beautiful. It's just sitting there, but it's almost like forgotten about. I've done impromptu conversations with people that come to the memorial, and more often than not, they didn't even know it was a memorial for survivors of sexual violence. Other people I've talked to, they didn't even know it existed, and they live in the area. So I really want to put a spotlight. My goal is to put a national spotlight on the memorial.
What is Minneapolis doing to help you in that goal? Besides letting you have the freedom to video without having to pay fees, what is their part in this?
Well, right now it's ongoing. So I just did a pre-production to get the ball rolling. And a big part of that was talking to the park because they're responsible for the memorial. But I have goals to talk to some of the major corporations that's in Minneapolis or close by the Minneapolis area, like 3M, Target, Best Buy, big groups like that, to see if I get some kind of contribution and backing for that. We have Pride Weekend, where they have a lot of things in one of the other parks in Minneapolis. I want to go out there and do some interviews and get their support. I'm still working on getting the who, what's, and why's behind me, but that's the good part of just starting. I have the opportunity to reach out to them, and they have an opportunity to get a part of this. One of the big things that I'm hoping to do for this documentary is actually get to speak to some key politicians like Mayor Jacob Fry for Minneapolis, some of the senators in the area. And I know it's a daunting task because, unfortunately, it's very hard to talk to politicians unless it's election time or you know somebody. The thing about being brand new is that I'm ignorant to the process. I'm not just going to write a letter and just be okay with that. I will show up at the office. I will show up at their events and just see if I can get in. And if I can get an opportunity to talk to them, that'd be great. If they decide they just want to put a snippet to be a part of it, that's also great. Because my overall goal is to get the word out far and wide that this memorial is here. And I really want people to look at it in a way of, why is it only one? Why don't we have one in every state, like a Milwaukee, like Chicago? Like Washington, D.C. Think about Washington, D.C., all the statues we have there, the only one that is not for war is the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. I think it would be awesome to have one up there for sexual violence survivors. And the reason I stress that is because doing this work so much, I did not realize how much of effect it had on the civilian and military world. Mostly the military world. And I'll just roll it up with this. One of the things I've been noticing in the military is that we have a lack of retention and enlistment. I used to be a recruiter for 3 years. We can say that there's problems with the economy. We can say that people are not as patriotic as they used to be, but I would question all of DOD to take a step back or even a survey and look at how many people are getting out or not coming in because of the threat of sexual violence in uniform.
Wow, that's a biggie. It's a huge problem. As you know, from being a SARC and working with SAPRO, it's massive. It's a sad state of affairs.
I worked a lot with NOVA, the National Organization for Victim Advocacy. As a matter of fact, they're celebrating their 50th year of service at the end of July.
Mm-hmm.
When they came up with the DSAT-P program, I thought that was awesome because when I became a victim advocate, we didn't have DSAT-P training. As a matter of fact, the requirements to become a victim advocate in 2005 was 8 hours. The requirement to become a sexual assault response coordinator was 8 hours. And they sent a team over from the Pentagon to the middle of Iraq in the middle of bombs and everything and said, hey, equal opportunity advisors, we have tagged you to become victim advocates. Here's your training. Go forth and tell the gospel about restricted and unrestricted. And that was a battle into itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it was necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the audience to understand what restricted versus unrestricted means is that anybody that's in the military that is raped or sexually assaulted has the option of filing a report that is restricted, meaning they file a report with the Criminal Investigative Division or whatever military criminal investigative agency is involved. There's action taken based on what the victim wants. They can pretty much have a big say in how much of that investigation occurs versus how much of it is just documented for record keeping. An unrestricted report means that it's going to go the full investigative route. So that's a kind of a big difference between what the military does and the civilian sector does.
Yes.
If you file a report in any civilian law enforcement agency, pretty much it's going to get investigated. I think there are more and more agencies who are adhering to the wishes of the victims.
I know that in some states, it's mandatory reporting, where other states, they're given the option to be restricted versus unrestricted. And just to share a little bit about that restricted versus unrestricted, before we even had a SAPA program in Department of Defense, if there was a sexual assault that happened, it was either going to go to CID or it wasn't going to be touched. That was the choices. And if it was sexual harassment, it fell under the Equal Opportunity Advisor Program.
Right. Administrative.
So and this is where we had the big gap. Well, when it was happening, it's like, whoa, people are not getting the help that they need. Do you remember that movie, the documentary Invisible War?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When they came out with that, that was really the Kickstarter to say, all right, enough is enough. We need to do something to take care of our troops, even if we have to just not go after the predators and get them help. So,
yeah, that movie was part of our curriculum in the 2-week Special Victims Unit investigation course that we did. Tell the audience what SAPRO stands for, if you would, Orvie.
Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office over the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Program.
And it's military-wide, if I remember right, not just Army. SAPRO is with all branches.
Yes.
And then the Army had its own separate kind of program called SHARP.
Yes, they have the SHARP program, but it falls under SAPRO. The only difference between the Army SHARP program and the SAPRO program for the other military entities is that the Army recognizes there's a direct correlation between sexual harassment and sexual assault. So they put them together in one field, whereas the rest of the military, they are still on the origins of the SAPRO program, which said sexual assault prevention and response is not in the same channel as sexual harassment.
You were a SARC, a sexual assault response coordinator.
Yes, there's like 3 different levels, but the 2 main levels is the victim advocate for my job, where I work directly with survivors. And then the next level is the sexual assault response coordinator, who's responsible for training the victim advocates and make sure there's enough victim advocates in the organization, but can work as a victim advocate themselves.
Right. And weren't the SARCs also kind of in a capacity of supervision over the victim advocates?
Fortunately, when they came over to train us, we were both victim advocates and SARC.
And SARC, okay.
Because, the problem was they wanted something that was field expedient. We really didn't have the personnel to have enough victim advocates than SARCs. And that was in the combat zone. In the rear or in garrison, they were able to structure that. But when it came over to us in Iraq, they needed us to do both so we could be interchangeable. So our Equal Opportunity Office, the program manager for EOA was kind of like the SAPRO program manager as well. And then the people that worked under them was victim advocate / SARC. Now, the SARCs were responsible for going to the other organizations to train up other victim advocates so they can have overwatch over those victim advocates. But until then, the Army said, hey, here's your marching orders, make it happen until we get everything in place.
Let's go back to the memorial. You had mentioned that your goal in making this documentary is to talk to some of the big wheels in the Minneapolis area, 3M, Target,
Best Buy.
Are any of those organizations people who originally donated to have that memorial built, or do you know who some of those original donors were?
I think a lot of the donors were not them, but people that were closely involved with Miss Sarah Super and the people that went to her meetings and trainings and stuff. The reason I said those big corporations is because they have a major footprint, not just in Minnesota, but nationwide.
Nationwide, sure.
And again, my goal is not just to do something for the state of Minnesota, which I think is awesome that they're the first, and they'll always be the first to have this memorial. But I want it to be something that goes out and says, hey, people, Minneapolis did this thing, and you can too. Let's make it happen.
Wouldn't that be great?
That would be awesome, because my viewpoint is this: the more that we have people talking about survivors of sexual violence, the more we have people that are willing to be victim advocates and supporters of the program, the less opportunity predators have to try to camouflage people to do what they do. Because let's be honest, these numbers that we're talking about, it's not, and it's never been a horde of predators all over the place. It's usually 1 or 2 predators that has confused a community to say what they were doing was okay or questionable enough not to intervene. Yeah. And that's where the problem is.
Yeah, that's what I call the rape culture. Absolutely. Orvie, what are you doing in terms of getting funding for yourself to make this documentary? Are you funding the whole thing yourself, or are you looking for donations?
One of the things that I've learned for digital cinematography is that it definitely costs money. Right now, I'm just out of pocket, credit cards, but that's another part of my journey, is to get donations. But I don't want to wait to get all the donations to make this thing happen. It's kind of like how I was just thrown in the fire, becoming a victim advocate before. I'm just going to start. And I've already started reaching out to people, taking videos, talking to other digital cinematographers for ideas and ways to get funding. As a matter of fact, I just came back from a conference with the Southern Documentary Fund. It's a group that actually donates grants to filmmakers, usually with people in the South. But because I have a connection growing up in Louisiana, I was able to go there and pitch it as somebody from Louisiana doing something up north.
That's so great. Once you get something set up, Orvie, I want to help support what you're doing, as well as that whole idea of getting more of these memorials built in every state. I think it's an amazing idea, and I think it's going to have an impact on changing that culture and making people more aware. Like you say, it's not just something that affects just that individual and their worldview. When you talk about sexual assault, especially in a large organization like the military, even the big corporations that you mentioned that you're hoping to get some funding from, I think people are just not aware of how the work aspect is so impacted by victimization of sexual assault and rape within these organizations and how it affects the workforce, what it does to people, how it changes them for the rest of their lives, and how they need support and help. Obviously, like you said, the more we do, the less opportunity there is for perpetrators to commit those crimes. I think we can have a huge impact on the prevalence rate, and what we do to hold perpetrators accountable would be part of that. Things like this memorial, things like your documentary and your efforts are exactly what this country needs to turn that around. So as soon as you set up some sort of an account or Venmo or PayPal or whatever it is that you're going to do to make donations possible, let me know, and I will get the word out through this podcast. I also, absolutely. Orvie, I want to stay in touch with you, and I want to keep tabs on where you're at with your project, how things are rolling, and letting us know what we can do to help. If you would do that for me, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And I greatly appreciate that too. And I like what you said about making this change so predators can't operate in the field, because unfortunately, there are some people that are out there to do ill. There's no prevention for somebody that doesn't pay attention to where it's like, stop, no, and I'm not okay. We have to put that light on them by having everybody else share the light. One of the things that I like to share, and this is something that people in the military community know me the most for in the field. I am very forward in my protection of survivors and for the community. So I like to tell people when I go out into the community, I like to make a hostile work environment for predators.
Orvie, I commend you and appreciate you, and am thrilled that you agreed to be part of this podcast today.
Thank you. I'm thrilled that you reached out to me, and like I said, this is my passion. Whether I hear from one person or 100 people, I'm moving forward with this.
Amazing. We'll be in touch and have you back on the show soon.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Orvie.
All right.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast. Huge kudos and deep appreciation to Orvie B. Baker Jr. Orvie, keep doing what you're doing, and know that I will do what I can to help promote your work on your documentary. For those of you who want to help Orvie, check out the episode notes for his GoFundMe page, as well as his Patreon donation account. All the information is there. I've also included some information about the memorial to survivors of sexual violence, as well as Orvie's book, Don't Touch Me. If you're able, please support Orvie through a cash donation. If that's not a possibility for you, please do all you can to help spread this story to everyone you know. And while you're at it, please tell everyone you know about this podcast. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe and rate the show. Finally, please do your part to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. One of the best ways you can do this is to start by believing a victim or survivor when they're telling their story or need your support. Thank you all for listening. It's an honor to have you as my audience. We'll see you next week.